So that was an example where if you didn't ask the question around, why are we paying out incentives to management when we haven't hit the numbers,
Yeah.
you wouldn't have got the response that, it's because they've worked hard and they've made this great acquisition, which subsequently didn't turn out to be true. And secondly, that we're going to use discretion whenever we need to. Now at least
Yeah.
what kind of approach you've got from the board towards the management of the company.
Teaminvest is an exclusive investment community with over 600 members across Australia and New Zealand. We use our proprietary software and the wisdom of the crowd to analyse companies like business owners, not speculators, to identify wealth winners and avoid capital killers. Our members expect an annual return of a minimum of 15 to 20%, with many of them achieving much more over the 18 years we have been running. At Teaminvest, we're about transferring our knowledge to the next generation of investors. Whether you have been raised with an awareness of investing or whether the family legacy begins with you, our goal is to educate and equip you with the knowledge and tools to build generational wealth. This week we're joined by a special guest from within our Teaminvest community. He's going to share with us details around AGMs, what an AGM is, and why, if you are a shareholder or an investor in a particular company, it's important for you to attend AGMs. Our special guest today is Stephen Mabb. He is a Teaminvest member. He's also recently become a Teaminvest facilitator. He's also the chairman of the Australian Shareholders Association. Well, Steve, thanks for joining us today. To start off, do you want to tell our audience who you are, introduce yourself, and just a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Kerry. So my name's Steve Mabb. I'm a Teaminvest member. Been a member for a few years, and have absolutely loved my journey so far with Teaminvest. Learning a lot, which is great. About to become a facilitator, so looking forward to that next step in the journey as well. I'm also currently the chair of the Australian Shareholders Association.
Okay.
That's a volunteer job, and I've learned a lot there as well. And one thing in particular we do at ASA is monitor roughly the top 200 companies from a governance point of view, from a retail shareholder's perspective. So I've been fortunate to be a company monitor and meet with a lot of boards and a lot of management teams over the last 4 or 5 years. And I've learned and seen all kinds of, good and bad behaviours there from some of those boards and management teams.
Yeah.
So got a few stories maybe we can get into today to talk about some of the things people might want to watch out for and potentially learn from.
Well, and we always love those stories, don't we?
Absolutely, yeah. Examples are a great way to bring these things to life, right? So yeah, that's obviously what I was hoping to chat with you about today, and in particular AGMs, annual general meetings, and how that might be helpful if it's something that you're not doing to your investing process, to kind of go and see management and boards up close and put your questions to them, etc. So yeah, that's probably the theme of our discussion today, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's a great theme, and listening to your diverse background, you're the perfect person to answer these questions for us. Yeah. Also, I think when we talk about AGMs, it's one of those things that you either go to them or you've never been to one.
Right.
So I think it's a great topic to cover for our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think if you haven't ever, kind of been to an AGM, it's a unique and different environment to kind of any other time of the year if you're invested in a company, because the companies are typically on their best behaviour at AGMs, and there's a lot of formal process that happens at the meeting as well, with things around voting and all of that kind of stuff. But basically, if you're a smaller shareholder or a retail shareholder, it's your one chance a year a lot of the time where you can actually meet with the board, meet with the management team, put your questions to them, see what they're like when you put them on the spot.
Yeah.
And that's where I get a lot of value, and I think a lot of other smaller investors that actually go and do AGMs get a lot of value is digging into those things and seeing what people are like in person rather than just in market announcements or press releases or scripted presentations that you might see at, other times during the year.
Absolutely. And I think we've done a couple of episodes actually on the importance of management.
Yes.
And knowing management and understanding management. So I think this is the perfect opportunity to see management in the flesh.
Exactly.
And ask those questions.
Yeah.
But if you haven't been to an AGM, given that it is something that's a very formal affair, it can be a little bit daunting. So I think this is a good opportunity to almost pull back the curtain, take away that feeling of being daunted, and open it up for everybody.
Absolutely, yeah. So the normal process is that a company has to have an annual general meeting once a year, as the name suggests, annual, and they have to put various issues to shareholders at those meetings to vote on. So they're called the resolutions. They'll be in a notice of meeting that comes out normally, 4 or 5 weeks before the meeting's due to happen.
Yeah.
The meeting normally happens a few months after the company closes its end of year books and produces its annual report. And it's a chance for shareholders to vote on things like the remuneration plan, like the election of directors, maybe things like capital management, etc. So there is a formal part to it where, and again, only if you're a shareholder can you vote. So you normally register at the start of the meeting and you'll get a voting card normally, and then you can vote your shares, or you can allocate a proxy, which is what a lot of people do. They'll give their vote to someone else to vote on their behalf if they can't make the meeting.
Okay.
You can still go to a meeting just as a visitor if you're not a shareholder.
My next question.
Yeah, so you'll see a lot of media there at times, or just people that might be interested in the company and they go along. Unfortunately, you can't vote and you can't ask questions typically if you're just a visitor. So you can attend and you can watch, but it's normally only shareholders that actually get to vote and ask questions at the meeting. So that's the normal process. There's another one called an AGM, or an extraordinary general meeting. They happen more on an ad hoc basis when there's something that has to be put to shareholders that can't wait for the AGM. It might be something like a takeover or a merger or a scheme of arrangement, those kind of things.
Okay.
Or maybe a board spill in very rare circumstances where the board's being spilled and a new board has to be elected. So that's when you might have an AGM, but they're pretty rare. Most companies are just going to have that annual general meeting once a year, and if you're a shareholder, it's your chance to A, have your say, and B, put your questions to management and see what they've got to say in response.
And how do you find out that these meetings are going on and where they're going on, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so the company should send you a notification if you've got your email address or your physical address nominated with the registry normally. They will send you a notification normally, a month or so in advance of the meeting.
So that's if you're a shareholder.
Correct, yeah. So that way you know that the meeting's coming up and that you can vote if you so choose. If you're not a shareholder, you can just look to the ASX announcements, so List Corp or the ASX website or whatever it might be, and or the company's investor relations site normally. So if you check in, a month or so after the annual reports come out, you'll normally be able to find the notice of meeting, when it's happening and where it's happening, and you can go along as a visitor that way.
Okay. And in Australia, a lot of these happen towards the end of the year, don't they?
They do, yeah. So most companies report, an end of June financial year, and then they've got a couple of months to get their annual reports out normally. So you start to see annual reports coming out in August typically, and then most companies are going to have their AGM sometime between September and the end of November is normally the cutoff if you're an end of June financial year. So there's a few months basically after your annual report comes out before you have to have had the meeting. If you've got an end of financial year that's at a different time, obviously you work back from there. So there's some companies that might have an end of year of, December 31st, for example. They've got to have their meetings in February or March, for example. So there's a few meetings in the first half of the year for companies with a different financial year. But the majority that report at the end of June, you're going to have AGMs in September, October, November kind of period. Very busy period. Most companies are doing their meetings there. So if you're invested in a lot of companies, there's a lot to judge.
It'd be a busy time.
Yeah.
Good time to set up your calendar at the beginning of the year, right? And can I ask, so you mentioned that the majority of them finish their annual year in June, but there are some that could finish at a different time. Why is that?
That's just purely up to the company. They can nominate a different end of financial year for them. So there's not any, legal reason for that. It's just some companies, might decide to have their end of financial year in April, for example, or, December or whatever it might be. That's just a personal choice or an individual choice of the company, basically.
Oh, wow. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about what they are. So why are they useful?
Yeah, well, I've got the obligatory Buffett quote here. I think Buffett, had something really interesting to say on management at one of the Berkshire meetings a couple of decades ago now. But I jotted it down just so that I don't mess up the quote. And basically, what he had to say is that you can really judge management by two yardsticks. The first thing is how well they run the business, and you can learn about that by reading about what they've accomplished versus their competitors and how they've allocated capital over time. And you want to take into account what they've achieved based on the hand they were dealt when they took over the job as a manager or a board, and compare that to what's going on in their industry. So that's one of the yardsticks, right? What have they done and how have they done it while they've been in control of the business? Secondly, you want to figure out how well they treat the other shareholders. And how do you do that? Well, Buffett's advice was that you read the proxy statements, which is just another way of saying annual reports, investor presentations, notice of meetings, etc. That's kind of what he means by proxy statements. And you want to see how they treat themselves versus how they treat other shareholders. And in Buffett's experience, he said, the poor managers usually don't think about other shareholders, and those two often go hand in hand. So, so I think it's an older quote now, but it's pretty instructive, and really the AGM and those annual reports are a great way for you to dig into those issues and determine what kind of management do you have, what kind of board do you have leading your company, and particularly if you're motivated to go along to the AGMs from time to time, put some questions to them that they haven't prepared for or that they haven't scripted, and see how they respond and see what they're like, up close.
Yeah, and that's something that we really focus on at Teaminvest, isn't it?
Absolutely.
The importance of understanding management, and we look at things like remuneration reports and all of that sort of stuff to really understand any risk that is involved with the
That's right.
management.
Yeah, exactly. And look, Teaminvest members in general are very good at digging into those kind of issues. And I know there are lots of Teaminvest members that go to AGMs. I see them there myself now, which is great. But there's also a lot that don't. And so if you're not attending the AGMs and you can, I'd highly encourage you to do it, because I think if you do enough, you'll definitely learn some things, good and bad, about the companies that you're interested in or invested in. And sometimes it might change the way you feel about that company or your decision to hold or not to hold on an ongoing basis with that company based on what you see at the meetings. So it certainly has for me, and I've got a few examples we can talk about there later.
Okay, so just before we get on to all these exciting examples, you've touched a little bit on what you can do at a meeting, but let's maybe expand on that.
Sure.
So what can you do at a meeting?
Yeah, so look, the normal process of the meeting is that the chair and the CEO will give addresses to the meeting. So they'll make a presentation, and it's all very scripted. And normally they'll say what a wonderful year the company's had, and thank everyone for their hard work. And those are all lovely things.
Yeah.
And then you'll get into the formal part of the meeting, which is where the resolutions that are in the notice of meeting are put to shareholders. And normally, if it's a well-run meeting, they'll give shareholders an opportunity to ask questions and make comments on each of those resolutions before, shareholders ultimately then cast their votes on each of those resolutions. So you ideally do want to follow that process to have a productive meeting, particularly if it's a big company and there's a lot of shareholders there. It can get pretty unruly and disruptive if people don't follow that process. So typically you want to ask the questions relevant to the resolution as it comes up. So for example, remuneration reports, one of the resolutions at all ASX company AGMs, and that's your chance to ask questions about how management's being compensated and, why they've used these metrics, for example, or whether the amount's fair and reasonable, etc. So when the remuneration report is up for voting, that's when you want to ask your questions about remuneration, obviously, if you're at the meeting.
So if we just looked at remuneration as an example, what sort of things could you be voting on around that?
So the remuneration report is just a standard resolution where shareholders get to have a say on whether they approve or not of this year's remuneration report. Now, that one is what we call a non-binding resolution. So it means it's only an instructive vote to the company. They don't have to do anything as a result of the outcome of the vote on remuneration. Where it does have some teeth is quite a few years back, we brought in a rule called the two-strike rule related to remuneration reports. And what that means is if at least 25% of shareholders vote against the remuneration report, the company gets what's called a first strike against that remuneration. And normally what happens then is the company reflects and goes, all right, what are our shareholders not happy about? What do they not like about our remuneration structure at the moment? What do we need to change for next year? Sometimes they don't do that. And then the following year, they might get a second strike, where again, more than 25% of shareholders vote against the remuneration report. Okay. When the second strike happens, even though again, it's non-binding, what can happen then is there'll be another resolution in the meeting to potentially spill the board. So if you were really unhappy and they're not listening and they're not doing the right thing in the views of, a significant number of shareholders, you can now vote for a board spill, and those board members would, temporarily at least lose their seat until there was then an AGM comes up to elect new directors. So most directors don't want that to happen, obviously. They'd rather keep their jobs and they'd rather not go through the inconvenience of a special meeting around a board spill. So there is some teeth to remuneration voting or remuneration report voting, even though they're technically non-binding resolutions. The two strikes give it a bit more teeth and make most of the directors want to listen and want to do something about it if they're getting that feedback consistently.
Wow. And that really links back to the Buffett quote that you said.
Exactly.
Right? Are they in it for the shareholders? How do they treat shareholders
Correct.
compared to how do they treat each other?
Correct. And really what you're looking for is alignment, right? If the company's doing well, it's okay for management to be doing well. But equally, if the company's not performing well, management shouldn't be receiving, record payments. So that's where most shareholders have a problem and will vote against remuneration, where they see management enriching themselves despite poor performance of the company, poor performance of the share price, etc. So when those two things get out of alignment, that's typically when you see a strike, or when there's been. Sometimes it can be used as a bit of a protest vote potentially, where you see really bad outcomes or bad behaviour potentially at times from the company during the year. And sometimes shareholders will vote against remuneration that year as a way to say, we don't like what you've done and how you've done it, even though it may have been short-term beneficial to the company. Sometimes you'll get a vote against remuneration that year as well to voice displeasure about the way they've conducted themselves during the year.
Because this is the opportunity for the shareholder to kind of let their voice be heard.
That's right. Yeah, have a say.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So do people have to attend the meeting to vote? So you've spoken about people in attendance, if they're a shareholder, they get to vote, or they could send somebody in proxy. Can you vote before the meeting?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kerry. And the short answer is yes. Normally you can vote in advance of the meeting through the registry. When they send you out the notice of meeting, you can normally vote online. More and more companies are also holding what we call a hybrid meeting. So that's where there's both the physical part of the meeting that you can go along to, or a live online meeting where you can vote in real time, again, online through whatever the platform is that they're using, and sometimes even ask questions live online as well through the chat or phone question system. So we really encourage companies to run hybrid meetings, particularly when it's that really busy time of year. You just can't get to, every one of your companies maybe all around the country, particularly when sometimes they might be on the same day, etc. Yeah. So hybrid meetings are a great way for more shareholders to participate and for you to be able to, attend even more meetings, even if it's the online only component. But we still really like the physical part of the AGM as well. We're not advocates for online only. Because the downside of online only is the company can get pretty good at controlling and scripting the questions and filtering the questions. Whereas when you have the in-person component, much harder to do that. And secondly, if you are going along, you often get a chance to chat to directors and management after the meeting over some tea and scones, and that's a chance for you too to learn a little bit more about what they're like as people when they're just one-on-one conversation with you. So it'd be a shame to ever lose the in-person component entirely. So we really like the hybrid idea where you can choose one or the other based on what works for you personally.
And I think especially when we're talking about, seeing these people and who they are as actual people,
Yes.
as opposed to how the media presents them or even how they present on media. You really need to have that face-to-face contact to be able to do that. It's those little nuances and the body language and all of those things.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And I've got some great examples now of, things that have come out in the physical part of a meeting, attending and asking questions and putting things to people in person that you just wouldn't have got if it was an online only process. So, definitely advocates for the physical or the in-person part of the meeting as well.
So just before we jump into that, so we've talked about that what we do at the meeting is the vote for the different resolutions. Now, you've also suggested that you can ask questions. So you can ask questions around the different resolutions. Do you have the opportunity to ask questions in general?
Yeah, so normally, again, if it's a good meeting and a good chair that, wants shareholder participation, when you're looking at just the general accounts, which is normally one of the earliest items of business on the agenda, that's a chance for you to ask general questions where it's not specific to a resolution. So most companies and most chairs will do that. Occasionally, they don't want shareholder questions and feedback and they'll try and skip past that. But yeah, generally speaking, the good companies and the good boards will encourage shareholder general questions when you're just looking at the financial accounts at the start of the meeting.
And I'm guessing that could potentially be a red flag if a company tries to brush over that.
That's right.
That section and not have that transparency.
Exactly. Yeah, very true.
Okay, so is it time to get on to some examples?
Yeah. So look, these are some personal examples of companies I've engaged with and meetings that I've attended, and some of the surprising things that have happened at these meetings. And as I mentioned, I'm a very active Teaminvest member now, so I'm going along to Teaminvest companies. But there's also some companies here that probably don't pass all the Teaminvest filters, and these might be some of the reasons why as well with a few of them, based on how their management behaves. So maybe
I'm excited. So pulling back.
Yes, these are personal experiences in my opinion, of course. It's just, my view of what's happened at these meetings and the board members that have been involved, of course. The first one was a company called EML Payments. And at the time, they were an ASX 200 company. This is 5 or 6 years ago. We're based up in Brisbane and we decided to start monitoring them for the first time. And this was through the COVID period where the company was doing gift cards, basically like reward cards and gift cards and that kind of thing for corporates and retailers, etc. And they'd had a difficult period through COVID with shopping centres, etc., being shut down and their revenue had been impacted, and so the metrics tied to their remuneration report were well down on what they needed to be. But despite that, they chose to use discretion as a board and award management most of their incentives that year. And they cited COVID as the reason and said, it's not their fault that COVID happened. They've worked really hard. I'm paraphrasing here, of course, but they deserve their bonuses. And we took a different view of that, as we normally would, which was to say it also wasn't the shareholders' fault that those things happened, and shareholders are down significantly as well. So why are we paying out, full incentives when the company hasn't hit its performance metrics for the year? And what was really interesting here was the chair responded to that and said, yes, we've used discretion this year to award these bonuses, but not only that, we're in a competitive environment for talent and for staff, and we'll continue to use discretion again in the future if we need to. So basically what he was saying was we don't really have an incentive plan, right? Like we're going to use discretion whenever we want to or whenever we need to award management incentives. That was a real tell for you as a shareholder, right? About what kind of remuneration structure you had at this company and how the CEO was likely to be paid. Maybe unsurprisingly, the company was going through or just completed an acquisition of a big Irish business at the time, Irish-based payments company, and they'd used that as one of the justifications for paying these bonuses despite not hitting the numbers, that management had done a great job renegotiating the deal and getting the price down, and they'd worked really hard, and it was a great deal for the company. A few months later, the Irish Central Bank announced that they were investigating this business for potential money laundering. So this prize acquisition wasn't looking so good after all, and then there was just a series of regulatory problems and regulator interventions that were brought against the company from that point on. And I think at one point the share price was down 80 or 90% as a result of all of this. So that was an example where if you didn't ask the question around, why are we paying out incentives to management when we haven't hit the numbers, you wouldn't have got the response that, it's because they've worked hard and they've made this great acquisition, which subsequently didn't turn out to be true. And secondly, that we're going to use discretion whenever we need to. Now at least what kind of approach you've got from the board towards the management of the company. Another more recent example is corporate travel.
Okay.
So it's in the news at the moment. I think it's been suspended from trading for quite a few months now due to some issues with their auditor not signing off on their accounts.
Okay.
It's being widely reported in the media at the moment and it's still ongoing. But again, we engaged with the board and the management team a couple of years ago, and their chair has a lot of other positions. And that's always something that we have a little concern with when you've got directors that have got a lot of jobs. How able are they to really dedicate the time that as individual shareholders we might want from them as a director to overseeing our company? So when we asked the chair about that, he really didn't like the question. He bristled at being challenged on his workload. And the question was also around what happens if we have a crisis in the travel industry, which is almost inevitable.
Yeah.
There's disruption to travel every decade or so, whether it's volcanoes going off in Iceland or COVID shutting down airports or whatever it is, there's often, travel disruptions and crises that hit travel-related companies. So that was an interesting tell that he didn't think that a crisis might be coming or that there'd ever be any, extra strain on his workload, so to speak. We also probed into kind of their ability to oversee the CEO, who's quite an entrepreneurial and, optimistic kind of guy. And they didn't give a very compelling answer there either about how as a board they're kind of overseeing and ensuring that, they're getting great information and that the culture that, they purport to having is being rolled out across their international businesses the way that, you would want. So again, not totally surprising that a year or so later we're now seeing some kind of blow up at the company where the board's missed something or the board hasn't caught that we've got some real accounting issues and we've got an auditor that's not willing to sign off on the company's accounts based on some revenue recognition concerns. So that's another example where, again, if you went to the meetings and you asked some of these questions, and I know there are a few other Teaminvest members there last year that asked some questions around M&A that got some interesting answers as well.
Yeah.
Gave you a bit of a tell. Another one that's definitely not a Teaminvest company. It's Australian Agricultural. They own big cattle farms.
Okay.
And it's been a very poor performing business for shareholders for many years now, despite having these amazing cattle properties and huge herds of cattle and very well known beef brands. The performance for shareholders has been really lackluster, and the financial performance of the company has been really lackluster for over a decade. So we were there representing shareholders again, and I didn't know a lot about the company. But what was interesting was the chair really wasn't shareholder friendly. He did not want questions coming out at this meeting. There was one shareholder that got up, a fund manager that got up early in the question session, and the chair told him to, sit down and be quiet. I don't want a long question. And the shareholder reminded him that, under the Corps Act, you actually have to allow me to ask my question. So please do, Mr. Chair, which I think he was surprised by. But basically, he was making it pretty clear that he wasn't, that interested in smaller shareholders. And it potentially was unsurprising because this business is about 75% owned by three really large shareholders. I think one of Twiggy's organisation, Andrew Forrest, owns a big shareholding. I think Joe Lewis owns a big shareholding. And then the chair's got a big shareholding. So as we were going through this, it kind of dawned on me that they weren't very shareholder friendly and they didn't seem that interested in their small shareholders. So I thought I'd ask a question around that to say, why are you a public company? Like based on what's happened at the meeting today, it seems like you're frustrated with, smaller shareholders and them asking you questions, etc. What's the motivation to be a public company? I was expecting him to, to chip me as well. But he actually gave a really surprising answer. And he said, yeah, that's actually a really good question. And, to be honest, if it was up to me, we wouldn't be. He goes, someone listed the company 10 or 15 years ago and, it is what it is. So again, just that one simple question has now probably told all of the smaller shareholders that if they had their way, they'd prefer not to be public. And they're certainly, not showing signs of being shareholder friendly or small shareholder friendly. So they were some, probably some less than savory examples. There are a couple of good ones as well to talk about. So
Well, let's finish on some
yes,
ones. I think
absolutely.
let's not have everybody.
Yeah. So Jumbo Interactive, I think that's a Teaminvest company at the moment. When we first started covering them, they were emerging from being a really small company to growing quite quickly, and I think they just entered the ASX 200 when we started covering them. And at the time, their remuneration structure was typical of a lot of smaller companies where there was some unusual things in there about options for family members and this kind of stuff from when the founder, had his family working in the business when they were tiny and et cetera, et cetera. So we challenged them on some of those things and asked them to, improve some of the ways that they had their REM structure and their board structured. And unlike some of the previous examples, they were really responsive to that. They really listened, and over the next couple of years, they set about, really improving the way that their remuneration plan worked, the way that they communicated it, the way that it incentivized the staff and the way it was paid out. And they've also really upgraded their board as well to be a much more capable and, large company quality board.
Yeah.
So we've been very complimentary with them in the last couple of years for that progression and transition that they've been on, where they've embraced that maturing into a bigger company and, operating at a higher level than when they were a little micro cap. Data3 is another one. I know that's a long-term Teaminvest company as well.
Yeah.
They've been through a lot of transition in the last few years with a very long-term chair and a very long-term CEO stepping down after many years of service. But one of the things the new chair and the board did was create a really good board skills matrix that showed all of the capabilities and experience of their current board to make it much easier for shareholders to see, what each of the people sitting on the board were bringing to the company, and why it's worth supporting them as shareholders when they're up for election.
Wow.
They've also just brought the former CEO back onto the board this year, which again we thought was a really good decision because he's got, many years of experience. He knows the company inside out, got great industry experience. He's still a large shareholder. So that's an example where after a couple of years they brought a very experienced executive back to help oversee the company and support the new CEO and new CFO. So there's some good examples where, engaging and asking good questions, is getting, good responses and good progress over the years. And I guess my summary with all of that would be, after you've asked those questions or you've seen those interactions or you've seen those behaviors, really the question for me is, do you think you've got competent and trustworthy management? That's one of the things we look for with Teaminvest.
Yeah.
And if you don't, then you probably should take some kind of action. Often that might be selling your shares. If you're seeing those things going on, and you're not comfortable with the people, whether it's board or management that are overseeing and running your company, then there's probably something to do as a shareholder if you want to minimize your risk. Now that's a personal choice for everyone, of course.
Absolutely.
But that's certainly where I get the value out of it, and a lot of members that read the reports and see what we have to report on after AGMs. That's where they get a lot of value, I think, is based on, the good or the bad that happens at the meeting and the good or the bad that was, responded to or answered by management and boards at those meetings.
Yeah. And I mean, it just goes to show that, in the bad examples that you gave, the outcomes didn't necessarily happen straight away.
Correct.
And even the outcomes weren't necessarily related to what was said at the AGM, but what was said gave some insight into who that person was, their character, and also their ability and their capability.
Exactly. Yeah, very true. And I think, Munger had a great quote on this, and I won't get the quote exactly right, but I think basically what he said was, we like to do business with good people. We've never done a good deal with a bad person. And that's the way Berkshire has approached, all of their deals over the years, I assume. So it's a little bit similar here, right? If you see some behavior or you see some, activity or action from boards and management that really, raises the hairs on your neck and you're not comfortable with, yes, you can't predict exactly what it is that might happen in the future, but it's much more likely that something's going to go bad in the future if you've got, leaders at the company that are operating that way. And again, that might be a chance for you to take some action.
Yeah. And there's a reason that we have that sense as humans, right? And it also goes back to why having that face-to-face and being able to do that rather than doing it online is so important.
Yeah, very true.
I'd also put out there that after hearing the comments and things like that, that the more often you go to these AGMs, the more, one, you get comfortable with it, but also the more that you learn what questions to ask and what are the important questions, and where are you going to find those nuances to go, oh, that was done well, or oh, there's something wrong there.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I've talked to Howard Coleman about some of these issues. Howard's a great, advocate and thinker on governance and management and board behaviour as well. And Howard helped me with something. Typically when we talked about the workload issue earlier of directors, where some of them might have a lot of jobs, and just asking them a question about their workload, they'll almost always say, "Oh, it's fine. I've got enough time. It's all good." So it wasn't, even though the concern was there, you weren't getting the response that you probably needed.
Yeah.
And Howard had a better way of framing that question, which we've adopted now, which was, what do you think your role is as a director beyond attending board meetings and reading the board papers when the director's up for election? And hopefully they're going to say some things like, well, yes, I attend board meetings, but also, I visit our factory, or I go out to our office, or I talk to our customers, or I, go and mix with the staff at various events and really get a sense of what's going on in the business. If you've got a really heavy workload, it's far less likely that they can do that. So hopefully they'll say some things like that because they are doing it. And if they do say that, a good follow-up, of course, is, okay, so can you give me some examples of when you've done that this year? Hopefully, again, they've got some examples of where they've been doing those things beyond just physically attending board meetings. And if we look at some of the big blow-ups of the last few years, good example that comes to mind is Star Entertainment. Now those directors are in the midst of an ASIC proceeding at the moment for, not fulfilling their director duties. And, one of their excuses was we didn't know what was going on. Management presented the papers to us and, we took it at face value that the CEO was telling us what was happening in the casino. We didn't know that there was money laundering going on in the high rollers floor or whatever it might have been. But again, the question here is, well, should you have known? Should you have been going into the high rollers floor and having a look at what was happening as a director? And if you had enough time and you're inquisitive, you probably should have. Like, it's a really important part of the business, I assume.
Yeah.
Is what's happening in those high value areas of the casinos. So that's where, again, you don't want a director that's really overboarded or has too many jobs, because you want them digging into these things and hopefully being inquisitive and looking for problems and bringing them to the board and the management team before the inevitable blow up happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really their role. That's
exactly
why they're there, right?
That's right.
Well, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Yeah, really enjoyed it.
I feel like you really kind of pulled down those curtains and made it accessible for anyone to be able to, or to feel comfortable.
Absolutely, yeah. Hopefully that was helpful. And look, I know a lot of other Teaminvest members go to AGMs as well. So, each and every state, there's plenty of members that are active and do these things as well. And no doubt there'll be some of them at the meetings, if you do decide to start going along, that you might be able to partner with and learn from as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Steve.
Thanks, Mary.
We'll look forward to having you back again.
Really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
We hope you found today's discussion insightful and inspiring. If you know anyone else who could benefit from hearing this episode, please hit the share button and pass it on. If you'd like to learn more about Teaminvest or our unique investment approach, visit us at teaminvest.com.au. And please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast for more episodes. Until next time, stay informed, stay invested, and keep building wealth.